She was betrayed. Her own husband looked right through her as if 23 years of military service meant nothing. The chandeliers sparkled overhead as her father-in-law's voice carried across the ballroom, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just a paper pusher playing soldier," he said with a smirk that could cut glass. The room filled with polite laughter, the kind that stings worse than any direct insult. She stood there in her coat, feeling the weight of her hidden stars beneath the fabric, knowing that in moments everything would change. But how did a decorated intelligence officer become invisible in her own family? The golden light from the chandeliers painted everything in warm honey tones, making the marble floors look like pools of amber. Catherine Winters stood just inside the doorway of the grand ballroom, feeling the weight of her military trench coat settle around her shoulders. The leather of her dress shoes gleamed as she surveyed the crowd of officers and their families, all gathered to celebrate her husband's achievement. Thomas sat at the head table, his dress uniform impeccable, laughing at something his commanding officer had said. Next to him, her father-in-law Frank held court, his booming voice carrying over the soft classical music. The retired Marine colonel still commanded attention even in his 70s, his bearing as rigid as the day he'd left the service 30 years ago. Frank spotted her and his weathered face split into that familiar condescending grin. He leaned toward the admiral sitting beside him, gesturing with his whiskey glass. "There's my daughter-in-law," he announced, not bothering to modulate his voice. 23 years in the army and still pushing papers in some windowless office. We keep telling her she should try for a real job. Maybe teach or something useful. The words landed like they always did, with the dull ache of familiarity. But tonight, instead of the usual resignation, Catherine felt something else stirring in her chest. A quiet anticipation like the moment before lightning strikes. The master of ceremonies, a distinguished colonel with silver temples, approached the microphone. His voice rang clear and authoritative as he thanked everyone for attending this celebration of military excellence. Catherine took a measured step forward, the sound of her footsteps sharp against the marble. Her pulse remained steady, controlled by years of operating under pressure that these people couldn't even imagine. "Before we conclude tonight's ceremonies," the MC continued, "we have one final presentation, an extraordinary recognition that could not wait for a formal Pentagon ceremony." He paused, letting the anticipation build. "For exceptional leadership in preventing what could have been the most devastating cyber attack in our nation's history, for coordinating multinational intelligence operations that saved countless lives, and for 23 years of distinguished service that has operated in the shadows to keep our nation safe. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Brigadier General Catherine Winters." The silence that followed was absolute. Someone's champagne glass slipped from nerveless fingers, exploding against the floor in a spray of golden liquid and crystal shards. Every head in the room swiveled toward her in perfect synchronization, like a choreographed dance of disbelief. Thomas's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Frank's whiskey glass stopped halfway to his lips, frozen in midair. His wife Margaret clutched at his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve as she stared at Catherine with eyes wide as saucers. The whispers started then, rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. Catherine walked forward with deliberate grace, unbuttoning her coat as she moved. When she let it fall from her shoulders, revealing the pristine white dress uniform beneath, the 2 stars on her shoulders caught the light like twin suns. Each step she took felt like reclaiming territory that had always been hers. The years of being dismissed, of having her work minimized to coffee runs and filing systems, pressed against her ribs. But alongside that weight was something else, something warm and bright. Pride. Not the sharp, vindictive kind, but the deep, settling pride of finally standing where she belonged. She had met Thomas 25 years ago at Fort Campbell, during a sweltering Kentucky summer that made the air shimmer like water. He was fresh from officer candidate school, still figuring out how to wear his authority without looking like he was playing dress-up. She was already a captain then, having fast-tracked through military intelligence with a mind that could see patterns where others saw chaos. He pursued her with the determination of a man who knew he'd found something extraordinary. Their first date was at a little barbecue place off base where the sauce was sweet enough to make your teeth ache, and the cornbread came wrapped in wax paper. He talked about his dreams of commanding troops, of making his father proud. She listened and smiled, already knowing that his ambitions would always burn brighter than his ability to achieve them. When she met Frank and Margaret 6 months later, the visit felt more like a military inspection than a family dinner. Frank's house was a shrine to his Marine Corps service, every wall covered with photographs from Vietnam, framed medals and ceremonial swords. He walked her through each one, explaining battles she already knew from classified reports she'd analysed. At dinner, Frank asked about her work. When she explained that she specialised in signals intelligence and cyber warfare, his eyes glazed over. "So you work with computers," he said, sawing into his steak. "Like those kids at Best Buy." Margaret tried to smooth things over with talk about wedding plans, but the dismissal had already taken root. She should have seen it then, the way Thomas's chest puffed with pride when his father praised him. While her own achievements seemed to evaporate in the room like steam. But she was young and in love, convinced that respect would come with time. The wedding was beautiful, held at a historic plantation with Spanish moss draping the trees like nature's own decoration. Frank gave a toast about military traditions and the importance of supporting your soldier, looking directly at her when he said it. Everyone assumed he meant Thomas. For 23 years, she had operated in the shadows of national security. While Thomas managed supply chains and signed requisitions, Catherine prevented wars that never made headlines. The Puerto Rico operation still gave her chills when she thought about it. Hurricane Maria was 12 hours from landfall when she received intelligence about medical supplies stuck in bureaucratic limbo. 300 critical patients in San Juan's main hospital would die without those supplies. She worked for 36 straight hours, calling in favors from contacts in 7 different agencies. She convinced an Air Force general to reroute a cargo plane, persuaded customs to pre-clear the shipment, and personally guaranteed the fuel costs on her own credit card when the budget office balked. The supplies arrived 2 hours before the hurricane hit. 300 people lived and nobody ever knew her name. The banking attack was even closer. It started with a single anomaly in a routine security scan, a piece of code that shouldn't have been there. Elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Within hours, she had assembled a team of the best cyber warfare specialists in the country, operating from a secure facility that officially didn't exist. For 5 days, they fought a silent war against an enemy that moved through fiber optic cables and satellite transmissions. The attack was sophisticated, targeting not just money but trust itself. If it had succeeded, every transaction on the eastern seaboard would have been suspect. The economy would have collapsed not from theft, but from doubt. When they finally traced the source and neutralized the threat, the relief in the room was palpable. One of her young analysts, barely 25, looked at her with tears in his eyes and said, "We just saved the country, didn't we?" She nodded, then reminded him that he could never tell anyone. At family dinners, while Frank regaled them with war stories from battles fought before she was born, Catherine sat quietly carrying secrets that would have made his stories sound like children's tales. Thomas would describe his latest logistics success, how he'd streamlined a supply route or improved efficiency by 3%, and Frank would beam with pride. When anyone asked about her work, she'd say it was classified and change the subject. They assumed that meant it was boring. The signs of Thomas's affair emerged slowly, like cracks spreading through ice. Late nights became early mornings. Business trips multiplied. His phone, once casually left anywhere, now lived in his pocket or face down on the nightstand. Catherine noticed because she was trained to notice, to see patterns where others saw coincidence. She found the first real evidence in his email, which he'd foolishly left open on their shared laptop. Jennifer Martinez, a civilian contractor with a defense firm. The messages started professional but grew familiar, then intimate. Meeting times that didn't match his official schedule. Hotel reservations in cities where he had no business. Catherine documented everything with the same meticulous care she applied to intelligence gathering. Screenshots saved to an encrypted drive. Credit card statements photographed. A timeline constructed with military precision. She wasn't planning revenge, just preparing for whatever came next. Some nights she would lie beside him, listening to his peaceful breathing, and wonder when she had become invisible to him. When had she transformed from the brilliant officer who'd captured his attention to just another piece of furniture in his life? The answer came slowly. It had happened so gradually that she'd missed it herself, like aging in reverse. becoming less visible with each passing year. The promotion notification came through secure channels on an ordinary Thursday morning. She had to read it 3 times before it sank in. Brigadier General. They were jumping her 2 grades, a rare honor reserved for exceptional service. The Pentagon wanted a quiet ceremony, the kind intelligence officers usually preferred. But Catherine thought about Thomas's upcoming awards ceremony, already planned and paid for, all their family and friends gathering to celebrate his minor logistics commendation. She thought about Frank's dismissive smirks and Margaret's pitying looks. She thought about 23 years of being the invisible backbone of operations that saved lives and prevented catastrophes. When she called General Morrison to discuss arrangements, she made an unusual request. Could the announcement be made at Thomas's ceremony? There was a long pause before Morrison's gravelly voice came back, tinged with what sounded like amusement. "You want to make a statement," he said. It wasn't a question. "I want to be seen," she replied. "Finally." "About damn time," he said. Now, standing on that stage with her stars gleaming under the lights, Catherine looked out at the sea of faces. Some showed admiration, others confusion, and a few, like Frank's, displayed something approaching shame. She stepped to the microphone, her voice carrying clear and strong. "Service comes in many forms," she began. "Some of you serve with rifles and boots on foreign soil. Others serve with keyboards and satellite feeds from rooms you'll never see. Both matter. Both save lives. Both deserve respect." She paused, letting her gaze rest on Frank. "For too long, we've valued only the service we can see, the kind that makes for good stories at dinner parties. But tonight, I want to tell you about the invisible war. The one fought in server rooms and secure facilities, where a single line of code can be more dangerous than any bullet." Catherine spoke for 10 minutes, sharing what she could of her declassified operations. The room remained silent, absorbing every word. When she finished, the applause started slowly, then built to thunder. Officers who had dismissed her for years stood in ovation. Young female cadets wiped tears from their eyes. As she stepped down from the podium, she saw Thomas approaching, his face a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite read. Behind him, Frank and Margaret waited, looking older somehow, diminished. "Catherine," Thomas began, then stopped. "General Winters," he corrected himself. I didn't know." "No," she said simply. "You didn't want to know. There's a difference." Frank stepped forward, his marine bearing still evident despite his age. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice rough. "I was wrong. I was." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "I was a fool." Catherine studied him for a moment. This man who had made her feel small for so many years. "Yes," she said, "you were." Margaret reached out tentatively, as if to touch Catherine's stars. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "They were always there," Catherine replied. "You just couldn't see them." Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the ballroom was being cleaned, Catherine sat in her car in the parking garage. Thomas had asked if they could talk, really talk, for the first time in years. She'd told him she would think about it. Her phone buzzed with messages. Fellow officers she'd worked with in the shadows, congratulating her on stepping into the light. A young captain she'd mentored, saying she'd cried watching the ceremony on the live stream. General Morrison, with typical brevity, outstanding. But the message that stopped her came from an unknown number. "General Winters, you don't know me, but I'm a first-year cadet at West Point. I'm 5'2", barely made the physical requirements, and every day someone reminds me I don't look like a soldier. Tonight you showed me what I can become. Thank you for being visible." Catherine sat in the quiet of her car, the weight of her stars still new on her shoulders, and smiled. The invisible war was over. She had won. 6 months later, the divorce was final. It had been surprisingly civil, perhaps because Thomas knew about the evidence she'd gathered, or perhaps because he finally recognized that he'd lost her long before Jennifer Martinez entered the picture. He kept the house. She kept her dignity. Catherine moved to a condo in Arlington with a view of the Potomac. The walls were bare except for one item, her commission certificate, signed by the president, promoting her to brigadier general. Frank and Margaret visited occasionally, their interactions tentative but genuine. Frank had even started reading about cyber warfare, trying to understand the battles she'd fought. One evening, Frank stood in her living room studying the certificate. "I spent my whole life thinking courage looked one way," he said. "Turns out I was looking at it wrong." "Courage looks like a lot of things," Catherine replied. "Sometimes it's charging a hill. Sometimes it's sitting in a dark room for 72 hours straight, stopping an enemy no one else can see. And sometimes, Frank added quietly, it's standing up in a room full of people who've ignored you and demanding to be seen. Catherine nodded. They stood together in comfortable silence. Two warriors from different eras, finally understanding each other. The young cadet from West Point wrote to her regularly. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she was struggling with the same invisibility Catherine had known. Catherine became her mentor, meeting for coffee when she could, answering late-night emails about dealing with dismissive classmates, and instructors who saw her size before her potential. How do you keep going when no one believes in you? Sarah asked during one of their meetings. You believe in yourself, Catherine replied. And you remember that their inability to see your strength doesn't make you weak. It makes them blind. A year after the ceremony, Catherine was invited to speak at the Army War College about asymmetric warfare and the future of military intelligence. The auditorium was packed, standing room only. She noticed Frank in the third row taking notes like a student. She began her lecture with a story about a young intelligence officer who prevented a biological weapons attack by noticing a single misplaced comma in a shipping manifest. The officer's name was classified, but Catherine knew her well. She'd been dead for 3 years, killed in a car accident, never knowing that her attention to detail had saved 30,000 lives. We celebrate the visible heroes, Catherine said, but we survive because of the invisible ones. Every system you trust, from your bank account to your water supply, is protected by people whose names you'll never know. They don't get parades. They don't get movies made about them. They go to work every day and stand watch over a sleeping nation. After the lecture, a line of young officers waited to speak with her. One lieutenant colonel mentioned that he'd restructured his entire unit's appreciation system after hearing her story, making sure the intelligence and support staff received equal recognition. You changed how I see service, he said. Thank you for that. Catherine thought about all the years she'd stayed quiet, all the dinners where she'd smiled through condescension, all the times she'd let others diminish her work. She'd thought she was keeping the peace, but really, she'd been keeping herself small. Now walking through the Pentagon with her stars visible, returning salutes from officers who once looked through her, Catherine understood something fundamental. Being seen wasn't about needing validation from others. It was about refusing to participate in your own invisibility. The intelligence work continued, of course. There were still threats to track, attacks to prevent, and silent wars to fight. But now she fought them from a position of acknowledged authority. Young intelligence officers, especially women, sought her mentorship. She made sure they knew their worth from the beginning, that they never spent decades believing their invisibility was normal. One afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. Margaret came alone, something she'd never done before. They sat in Catherine's office, surrounded by monitors and secure phones, drinking coffee from paper cups. I need to tell you something, Margaret said, her hands trembling slightly. I knew what you were, what you did. Frank's old Marine buddy, General Patterson, he told me years ago. He said you were one of the most brilliant intelligence officers he'd ever encountered. Catherine set down her coffee carefully. Then why? Because I was jealous, Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You had everything. The career, the recognition from people who mattered, the purpose. I was just a Marine wife who organized bake sales and charity drives. If Frank knew how important you really were, what would that make me? The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Catherine reached across the desk and took Margaret's hand. You were never just anything, she said. We all serve in different ways. Your service mattered too. Margaret squeezed her hand, tears running down her cheeks. I'm sorry I let you be invisible. I'm sorry I was part of it. We all were, Catherine replied. The important thing is that we see each other now. 2 years after the ceremony, Catherine received her second star, becoming a Major General. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon this time with full honors. Frank and Margaret sat in the front row. Frank in his dress blues that still fit after all these years. Sarah Chen, now a second lieutenant, stood in formation with the honor guard. Thomas wasn't there. He'd remarried Jennifer and moved to Seattle, starting over with someone who would never outrank him. Catherine wished him well, genuinely. They had both been trapped in roles that didn't fit, and now they were free. General Morrison, now retired, pinned on her second star. You know what I admire most about you, Winters, he said quietly. You didn't just make yourself visible. You lit up the whole shadow world. Every intelligence officer serving today stands a little taller because of what you did. After the ceremony, Catherine stood in her new office, looking out at the Arlington Cemetery in the distance. Thousands of heroes lay there, many whose stories would never be told. She thought about that young analyst who'd helped stop the banking attack, about the officer who'd caught the biological weapons shipment, about all the invisible guardians standing watch. Her phone rang. Another crisis, another threat that the public would never know about. She answered it, ready to coordinate another invisible war. But this time, everyone knew who was leading it. That evening, driving home through Washington traffic, Catherine thought about the journey from that first dismissive comment at Frank's dinner table to this moment. 25 years of service, most of it unseen, unacknowledged. She could have stayed invisible forever, safe in the shadows where no one could diminish her because no one knew she was there. But hiding wasn't the same as humility, and being overlooked wasn't the same as being humble. Sometimes the greatest service you could provide was to stand up and be counted, to show others that they didn't have to accept invisibility as the price of service. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen, made squadron leader today. First woman in my unit's history. Thought you should know. Thank you for showing me it was possible. Catherine smiled, pulling into her parking space. Tomorrow would bring new threats, new challenges that required the invisible warriors to stand guard. But tonight, she would stand on her balcony, looking out at the city she'd protected for so many years, finally visible to herself. The stars on her shoulders caught the moonlight as she stood there, no longer hidden, no longer diminished, no longer willing to be anyone's background. She was Major General Catherine Winters, and she had always been enough. It just took her 25 years to make everyone else see it too.